I moved fast. All right, y'all. You got it.
All right,
That's not easy.
thank you. Kevin, this I'll call this meeting to order.
Want me to do roll call?
Yeah,
So Councilmember Middleton. Present. Councilmember Hotchkiss and Fossey are not currently here. We have guest speakers, Charlie Ackerman, Margot Bardo, and Rebecca Radmill here.
hi Margot,
Hi,
There you go.
thank you for coming.
thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So, just really quick, starting out, everyone, we introduced everyone. Charlie and Rebecca, this is Margot. Margot's one of my constituents, and she's kind of the person that kind of brought the idea to me to start thinking about. We have a rental registry, but kind of enforcing it and trying to get, things back on track. So that's why she's a part of this conversation, and she'll be a part of the, conversation. So,
Nice to meet you, Margot.
Thank you.
so, I was looking up Syracuse's registry, and there's just a part, I guess, and then I'm gonna read like a few things, and then everyone can just add their own thoughts to what they think. And in the city of Syracuse, it says the rental registry application, if you own 1 or 2 family rental properties in the city of Syracuse, you are required to register your property with the Division of Code Enforcement. Rental registry is required every 3 years or after a sale of a property. The fee to apply to obtain a certificate is $150. After the inspection is required prior issuing to the certificate, the rental registry ensures tenants are living in rental units that are safe, healthy, and up to code.
Do you want to do a quick, like, current structure recap for what we have
They
in
don't-
our ordinance? Or
I don't-
did y'all already do that?
No, we don't, but this is, oh, you want me to, you think I should do that first? Because we don't really, I don't think they really enforce anything at all.
So the presentation that I gave to see that last week
Uh-huh.
was a walkthrough of the current structure. And when it was implemented or attempted to be implemented, what the challenges.
Can you
were.
explain it to me?
Sure, so
Thank you.
we currently have a code ordinance, rental registration
Mhm.
26 or
This is
265.
it right here.
Yeah. It's a rental registration requirement with the option to consent to an inspection. It requires every owner of a rental property, except owner occupied 2 units, to completely file a rental registration application with the city clerk. Bunch of the identifying details are required. It also requires a triannual inspection, certificate of compliance prior to occupancy, but again, it gives the option of consenting to that inspection rather than a licensing component that explicitly requires it. The initial implementation, when it was adopted in 2013, you are correct, it is not presently enforced. The initial implementation saw 50% about participation from local property owners and only about 50% of registered units inspected. The challenges that Tom Costello at the time, the previous co-director, and Chris Schleider since have identified, cited limited staff when it comes to implementation and gaining access to the occupied units as primary barriers. The limited staff piece is what I discussed with CVAC last week in terms of restructuring code to allow for increased CDBG reimbursement. And then as far as adjusting the current ordinance, it should, if it's going to be pursued to be enforceable without any liability concerns, the proactive code enforcement ordinance will need to include a licensing component.
And kind of like what they have in Syracuse, that's what they're paying, right? That's for to obtain the certificate. So they're paying $150 in Syracuse to do that.
Ours does also have fees built into it. I mean, again, it's not enforced.
Yeah.
But there is revenue that is collected from the rental registration as well as the licensing fee.
And then I wonder if we can find out, it's probably hard, but what they did with that, like where did they put that money? Probably in a general.
Where they end up putting it. I mean, you could reach out to them to ask where that's going. It would
Yeah.
also, I mean, locally be up to the city to determine where that ends up being allocated, whichever budget line item, whichever department. There is a template for proactive rental registration ordinance that is broadly used, broadly recognized as like legally sound, but also implementable.
Where can I find that out?
I can send it.
Okay,
to-
and then I'll send it to our court counsel to see. To see that.
Mhm. We'll chat after. We'll chat after. Yeah.
Yeah, as a landlord, as a real estate broker, somebody that deals with, you know, I was there when they put the rental registry in. And my attorney, gave me his opinion that, that I should choose not to participate in it. Because it was, I don't have to. So why would I put myself through something that I don't have to do? And I know that that is the feeling of a lot of landlords, you know, there's, you know, at the time, this was before the new R3 zoning passed in the student area. And my business was, I mostly do student, was operating in a gray area of the law where we had the functional family law, but at the same time, everyone knew that we were violating the functional family law and everybody was okay with it. So why would I invite code in to see that I am existing in a gray area of the law? So we chose to ignore it, and there was no way for the city to do anything about it because it would be unconstitutional. You know, I do not have to admit to any sort of activity that may be outside of the bounds of the law. Not that I am, but you understand where I'm getting at. Whereas I do think that it's critical that we have a rental license so that we make sure that the properties that we have are kept in some sort of safe order. Right now, what code requires for certificate of occupancy is not difficult at all. No peeling paints, doors and windows that close appropriately, smoke and carbon detectors, handrails on the staircase. They're not really looking for much more than that, and that at a minimum standard to be achieved should be a requirement for all properties. We should have windows and doors that close properly on all properties. We should have carbon and smoke detectors in all properties just for health and safety. You know, what a certificate of occupancy looks for today are not any sort of structural questions. Yes, of course, if there's water entering the building, but they're not looking for, you know, the repair of the furnace. They're not looking for the repair of the water heater. They're not looking for a number of things. They're looking for a minimum standard of living that should easily be able to be met by all units without any sort of problem. Now, if it was a license to rent, then I would be compelled to let them in. But I certainly do not have to choose to get a to allow them in for some sort of registry. Like, hey, here's all my problems. Come on in, take a look at it, write me a bunch of tickets. That seems silly. Who in their right mind would actually do that? Whereas if it was a license that compelled a landlord to be involved in the program or be involved, then they could do that. And if they chose not to get a license, they can choose not to get a license. They just then can't rent out the property. And then we're at a point where there's not some sort of illegal taking going on by the city or
Margot?
So, yeah, and I think the voluntary registry, that's only gonna be the upstanding landlords that are gonna participate. So the voluntary piece is kind of not really gonna do much, I don't think. If you've got 50%, I mean, it's the people that don't participate that we really want to address. I got involved with this concept several years ago when my daughter was a student in Albany and was living in an unsafe apartment. And Albany also has systems in place. Kenya, I sent what I found from their website to you, and they could actually go in. So in that particular circumstance, their legislation or their rules allowed them to, I called, made a complaint. It allowed them to look up the landlord, see that he hadn't complied with his inspections in several years, or he hadn't paid his registration fee or whatever the fee was for. And my daughter wound up walking out of the apartment, losing her security deposit. They lost like $1,500. But what I was able to do was to alert the city to the problem so they could address it with him. And I think that's my focus is we want to keep these properties safe and clean. I live on the west side. I walk all the time. And part of it is these landlords have to take care of their properties. And I think that's the safety of the people and, the beauty of the city.
Margaret, you're describing pretty effectively our current reactive code enforcement system. What other upstate communities have implemented is a proactive code enforcement system that requires routine inspections for the rental licensing aspect, so that property owners who want to provide occupancy to human beings are required to demonstrate that they are actually safe, healthy, and habitable. It's entirely, and if I heard you correctly, Charlie, it's not an unreasonable expectation that property owners should be required to maintain habitability, particularly when they're extracting profit for themselves in order to pay that occupancy. And that I think is the opportunity if we're talking about combining revising the existing rental registration ordinance to include that proactive and licensing component.
Which I think would be wonderful. And my simplified thought process, because I'm not involved in the, your government and your budget and all that stuff, but like, if they're paying for that fee, if they're getting registered, why can't that money be used and funneled directly to staff a position to do that, so that it's not, because budget's always a concern and I completely understand that, but I think it would be I would hope that it could fund itself.
I think that for reputable landlords, they want to have this. I said that on the property on the west side, I don't get inspection, but for other properties, I'll have the inspection up front. So when I get a mother that says that the property is not to code, because everybody's always got to complain about something, I can just produce a document.
Yeah.
Yes. Last month, I had the city in here. I don't know what to tell you. And you just have this the license needs to be displayed in a public place, as well as, some sort of phone number that can be called if the tenant feels that the license has fallen out of their rights, potentially some sort of brief statement about what habitable places should look like. And I know that Rebecca's gonna cringe up when I say this real quick, but when it comes time to evict, if I have a certificate of a license of occupancy, then I don't have the problem of the tenant going into court. The first thing that the tenant says every single eviction is this property is not habitable. Whether it is, whether it isn't, whatever, that is the first statement that is said. And now I have a 30-day stay while somebody comes out to inspect it. Well, if I have a license that says that I have been operating to some sort of standard with the city and I am in good standing, then this will move along my process and make it easier to conduct business in a reasonable way.
You don't like that, Charlie? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
While it may not be the case for you where there are habitability
Of course
issues
there
or code violation, I am in landlord tenant court 3 times a week in the city, and we have dozens of landlords who are exploiting tenants.
Yeah.
By not providing habitable conditions. The challenge when they get to eviction court is that many tenants aren't aware of their rights when it comes to a right to a safe habitable
Yeah.
home. And they may make a case for themselves that there are code issues and that there are safety hazards, but there's a legal process
Yeah.
that follow that includes calling code, that includes informing their landlord, and all of those steps. If they're not followed, an eviction can still move forward. So this is detrimental, not only to our neighborhoods, but to our residents who are being, just chronically displaced. And the conditions of so much of the most often extremely low income housing that landlords are attempting to provide, that also perpetuates displacement, because folks are there, we have 450 families in emergency shelter last year. They don't have, our limited stock is such that they don't have too many options when they're looking for a new apartment. So they're left with the untenable choice of this is better than under a bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how.
So with that, there will be negative consequences that come of this, which are these ultra low income properties where it is not economically viable to bring the property to a code standard, which I agree 100% should be the minimum, that these will become vacant. And they will
You know,
become,
just let them sit there?
yes.
Well, then never mind.
No, there's not enough money. So there's not the tenant, what they can afford compared to the repairs to bring, there was a unit I was in the other day that was very well beat up and would not by any stretch of the imagination meet our standard. There's at least $20,000 worth of repairs that need to go into this unit. And with the rent that a tenant that a low income family could afford to pay, it is not going to be economically viable for the landlord to do it. And in many cases, the landlord will just choose to either let that unit go fallow or to walk away from the building in general. And this is a real world consequence of this. Now,
I hear about it in New York City. I know and they're doing it.
You're not completely, that is true. I think there are also studies that show that the landlords who invest the least in their properties are extracting the most profit because of that. So it's true. We will, but that's the other side of the coin to this housing issue is we need to be developing enough units that are affordable at a 35,000 annual salary rate and below.
Yeah.
For families.
I know in New York, I know the same issue they're having in New York City right now is they're not, so like someone lived there in a rent stabilized apartment since the 60s, and then they die or they move. They're not, it's costing too much to renovate it, so they just leave it empty. So there's like buildings that are just empty. So I know what you're talking about.
It's an opportunity for the city to dedicate funding
to fix it,
to renovations and to rehabilitation. The
if
funding is there, we're just not allocating it the way we could be.
if the city wants to get into that business, great. I'm all for it. I think that I've made clear to everybody in this table that I believe the city should be taking more of a role in it. But with that said, again, it's going to cause a short-term housing shock, right? Like I think that it should happen. I think that this is exactly what we should do. I'm just saying eyes wide open. This will cause a short-term shock.
And what are you thinking? Like how many? Like I feel like if you're gonna rent something out, like it should be habitable.
So what's the repercussion? They come, the inspector, there's an occupied unit. The code guy comes, and says, this is not habitable. So the landlord looks at it and he says, all right, I get $750 a month from these people. After my mortgage, my taxes, my insurance, my water, all my expenses, I'm making about $170 a month in profit on this. This is going to cost me 20 grand to bring to some sort of standard. That is multiple years worth of profit that is going to go into it. And they're going to, in many cases, they're going to say, okay, I guess that's it. So now what happens to the tenancy of this person? You cannot compel someone to spend $20,000 to fix a place. They can choose to let the tenancy end. So what happens to the person in that unit? Because now, again, there's a huge amount of good landlords that do maintain their properties, that this will be fine. But when we're talking about that lower 20%.
They're already doing that. So we're already seeing landlords who are weaponizing code and code's ineffective response to illegally attempt to evict residents. And so the displacement is already occurring. Again, I don't think you're completely wrong. I think most proactive code enforcement adjustments like this are phased in by
I was thinking.
whether it's a particular district, census tracts, land, like they're phased in so that it's not the initial shock.
The
But if we're
landlords would
gonna
sue.
have a responsible
You said the
conversation
landlords would
around
sue?
it, then we can talk about resources that will be connected for relocation when this is implemented.
If it was targeted, if there was any sort of spot enforcement, if it was district by district, I would I feel pretty confident in saying that the landlords would sue. They would tie it up in court and make it unenforceable if it was district by district. Because, and I understand that it has been done, but I guarantee wherever it's been done, there's been lots of lawsuits. Either we do it as one thing where there is equal protection, enforcement, or you're gonna be tied up in a much more, I'm not saying that this is a reason not to do it. I'm just saying, I think that it needs to be done. I think that I want on my properties to have a license on my front door that says that this is a reasonable piece of property where a person can expect habitability. I think that that is what is best. There is 20–30% of our units right now are absolutely shot. They do not come close to meeting any sort of standard of habitability. That's a lot of people. We're talking about thousands of people, hundreds and hundreds of units that there's going to be a big question asked with all of a sudden. Again, I think that it needs to happen. I'm just saying eyes wide open. Let's think about what the result of that is. And let's think about if there's a way to mitigate said result so that we don't end up, you know, a lot of times legislation is passed with really, really wonderful motives with really bad results. In 2019, there was the reform to evictions. What was it? The reform to eviction law. As a result, it destroyed rooming houses. Rooming houses became completely ineffectual as an investment property. Again, I believe that the government should be running these houses, but with that said, it made it so that a guy that was doing boarding houses, the Dixie, these terrible, horrible places that were a point of last resort for a number of people, the business model failed as a result of the legislation reform. And I think it could be argued that that could be help a causative factor in our spike in homelessness.
Just for the record on that one, the Housing Stability and Tenant Protections Act that was passed in 2019 I think rightly impacted the implementation locally, but any adverse impact after the rooming house piece of it, I would say, and I think legal services and legal aid would agree, that it prevents displacement to enough of an extent to counter any cause of homelessness. But I don't, again, like a responsible, you're right, to have the conversation responsibly around enforcement and implementation is to take the outcome into account. And so it's a conversation around what relocation assistance can be provided. And that is
To where?
that's part of it.
Where they go.
But you're saying, yeah, the fact that our housing stock is so limited is absolutely part of this. It's gotta be a full conversation, but I don't think we stop one good measure simply because for decades we've also ignored the other.
Again, I think that it's something that we should do. I'm just saying, relocation assistance, the problem is that we've had a festering problem with code enforcement for 30 years, where we have not done anything proactive, reactive, or sideways to make sure that there is any sort of standard. There will be people that are like, because, okay, are we saying that the landlord cannot collect rent if the property is not licensed? I think that the code court would say that that is true, right? So if he chooses, they choose not to collect rent, then the property further disintegrates, further spins out, we lose further units. What can be done? I'm just saying, it's just, I think that I made my point clearly. It's just something that needs to be thought of. We could be talking about a lot of units.
So I think what time, where are we at in time?
11:28.
Okay, so I was just wrote down a few things. I think maybe we could meet again. I'm gonna research like some enforcement issues or some things that may come up. I don't know if anybody else can think of some things that may come
Yeah,
up.
I would recommend the Safe Housing Task Force did address looking at the difference between our current enforcement approach
Mhm.
and mimicking the city of Rochester's municipal violations approach. That's been extremely successful in Rochester. So either,
Any lawsuits or anything?
so here's something, so Alan Malik is actually like nationally known. He works for the Center for Community Progress, or at least contracts with them, as the czar when it comes to understanding rental legislation and licensing. One of the things that he made clear, when myself and others met with him in 2021, is that well over 1,000 municipalities have passed proactive inspection ordinances. And even if liability is a concern, that shouldn't stop municipalities from taking responsibility to provide for the basic health and safety of residents. So I don't think, is liability a consideration? Yes. And should we look to mitigate every adverse potential impact? Yes. But we still have to base decisions on the city's responsibility to provide habitable housing for its residents, particularly its most vulnerable.
I agree.
I agree, but
I mean, I can send you a bunch of all of that.
That's, yeah. No, I don't have anything else to add to that. I think that it's something that needs to be done. I think that we need to meet, that we should, all human beings deserve a clean, safe, habitable place to sleep. There is no question. It's how we deal with that transition that I think is going to be most difficult and impactful.
and how to enforce it too. I think that's kind of my main.
I think there's
So
enough on that.
Yeah.
the limited staff piece, and Margot, you're right, so. One of the implementation challenges that is often cited is capacity, limited staff, but you're right, the fees. And fines that go into actually enforcing this ordinance would funnel and should funnel back into code enforcement activities. At the same time, code enforcement activities are currently only reimbursed by CDBG dollars at 50%.
Mhm.
They could be reimbursed at close to, if not completely 100%, if we restructure how officers, which jurisdictions are being targeted. That was the conversation that the Community Development Advisory Council had last week. And so that's something, I mean, this is something that CDAC is discussing too, so there's a lot of I know that, I mean, there are residents too, I mean, that's the number one thing that come up is housing quality, the fact that neighborhoods are crumbling, so.
And you know, I mean, if you have $100 per unit fee, of course, everything gets passed along to the tenant. But we're talking about $8 a month, you know, that is going to be to guarantee that a person has a clean, habitable, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, if you look at a building, there's a building that I manage is 36 units, you know, that could easily be inspected in one day. That's $3,600 in revenue that could be generated for the city. I cannot imagine the code guy is making $3,600 a day. And if he is, I'm applying. So, you know, it could easily cover itself. It does not take them more than 20 minutes to do a code inspection. There is a list. You walk around, you look, you say, you know, this isn't like they're climbing up in the rafters. They're not climbing up in the rafters. You know, this is a visual inspection of the property. It does not take long. I think that it should be by unit is how you should be thinking about it. I don't think that it'll be heavily impactful to the landlord. You know, I mean, he's got a 4-unit. It costs him $400 a year to get this certificate of rental. And yeah, I mean, it's more money than a person wants to pay. A person always wants to pay zero, but it's not like this is some sort of outrageous thing. If I have to,
and it's like you were saying, it's kind of like a protection, so it's protected. Yeah, it's protecting the landlord and protecting.
everybody's protected.
Yeah.
Like health department has to inspect restaurants.
That's
to
right.
ensure that
Yeah, that's
they're
right.
not
That's
going-
right.
Oh, sure, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
There are hazardous conditions that are actually poisoning human beings that we're just letting happen
You're right.
because we're not enforcing this ordinance.
I agree completely.
I like that idea per unit fee.
It is just, you know, it's just simple, it's easy. You know, an average owner occupied situation, he's probably in a 3-unit. You know, if they live in 1 unit, they have 2 other units, that's $200 a year. Yes, it is an additional tax, but and there, you know, I don't know if it's
And then I had a question. How would we like start to enforce it? So we won't know who's running. What if someone's like not honest about like their situation? Like, how do we know that someone,
sorry, what was the
like,
question?
how would we enforce it? Like, how would we know exactly who's renting? So like
That's where the rental, well, I guess I'm not, do you mean the tenant or the property?
the property owner.
So that's where the rental registration piece does come in and would need to remain in this kind of ordinance. So the registration is just as important
Okay,
because we have a lot of landlords locally, I mean, and this happens everywhere, who set up an LLC and
yeah.
operate using the LLC. So it's difficult to identify the property
Yeah,
owner, the
yeah.
primary contact. The registration should still be a part of this ordinance. It just needs to be, again, adjusted to represent that licensing component. And I mean, there are several things.
And LLCs would have to register also.
Well,
you'd have
the property owner
You'd
would
have
have
to
to
what?
identify.
Oh, yeah. What'd you say, John?
right now in the rental registry, as it's written, it says that I have to put a property manager down. I know as a property owner, I would not wish to pierce the corporate veil. There is a reason why we establish LLCs, and it's for liability and such.
Okay,
There is no reason that the licensing component itself, which has somebody has to represent as the property manager for that property, has to be written down, but necessarily who is the owner. That's an entirely different question that is answered by the state or federal government at that point. You know, yeah, I get it. I understand. But if I were to say, I am the owner of this property, I've pierced the corporate veil and now I'm open to lawsuit. If I have an LLC and say this property manager is your point of contact, I have a protection from, let's say the guy slips and falls and breaks his neck. So he could sue for that property, but all of my assets need to be protected behind that. That is the reason we have corporate structure.
The way that that is addressed and incorporated into the conversation, and we haven't even, I mean, we haven't gotten here, but as far as the code enforcement software, that makes sense in terms of, I like the piercing the corporate veil image. But there does need to be some component where code has, or code court has the opportunity to understand which properties are covered by which LLCs. That doesn't need to be public information to put property owners potentially at risk of liability, but for the full enforcement, I do think it's important that we have a software that has the capacity to filter by LLC to identify the owner. I want to just add here too, and this may just be because I don't know the current status of the code enforcement software. Cities Rise, back in 2020, the city of Binghamton received almost $600,000 from the state to implement software that was supposed to make code enforcement more efficient, give code enforcement more capacity. That there was a City of Binghamton RFP in 2020 for code enforcement software. I'm not sure, as someone who works within the sector, what the status of the code enforcement's current software is, and would be interested in knowing where that stands.
Something else I'd like to bring up is, so there are a number of units that are operating sub-legally, I'm going to call it, inside the city. Someone has, split up an apartment and made it into 2 units. This happens all over town frequently. So I think that if we want to make this the best possible result, I think that potentially there could be a what's it called, an amnesty that can happen with it, where the units can be brought into a legal use. That way we don't have a tenancy issue. So when we start doing this, I don't think that it's a huge amount, but we're probably talking 10-15% of the total units out there just don't exist, right, in the described use of the property. And if there could be an amnesty component that goes along with it, we will see landlords much more excited about, bringing everything into line, because right now they're just going to hide their units as best they can to protect whatever it is. And you have tenants that have established homes in there. I think as long as the property is made or is to a code standard, they go in and they say, yes, this can meet a certificate of occupancy, that the unit itself can be brought in as a legal unit. And I think that we would be, because the idea is not to reduce units. We have a unit problem. So if there could be an upfront amnesty, whereas, somebody in an R1 has converted into, their place into a 2-family, this happens a lot. And it is sublegal. But if our concern is habitability and maintaining the unit numbers and increasing the unit numbers, then a nice component that could go along with this, so that we don't have more negative ramifications, would be some sort of amnesty that would allow them to bring their property into legal status without threat of loss.
So first, before they.
Think in one bill.
Okay.
And I had one more, this is in the notes that I'll send you. But just so that you're aware, you may already be aware, the Broome County Health Department was awarded almost $625,000 annually for this year through 2029. For the New York State passed legislation for a rental registry and proactive inspection program that they're piloting. So our health department is involved in that pilot. They do want to target 2 zip codes in Binghamton. I believe they have already met with the mayor and code enforcement. I don't believe they received much reciprocation during that meeting, but that may be something that can be pushed, particularly because of the funding that is attached to it. It's primarily related to lead issues and significant safety hazards, but it's a funding opportunity if that's a primary concern.
Do you know who's in charge of that already?
You can send it, yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. So, what are we at?
11:43.
Thank you. I guess we'll meet again. Like I said, I'll figure out some questions. We'll look into some things, I guess, like, do you want me to invite someone from code down here for our next meeting? Maybe to answer questions, like, I can see if we can get someone.
Yeah, the only notes I got from Corporation Council and the planning department were that if you expected their attendance as guests, that there would be like some prepared questions for them.
Sure.
At time.
Sure.
Other than that, I think they can coordinate with their offices to.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah. They're a code officer and code attorney would be.
Okay.
That's right.
Thank you. Yes, I'll look up those things. I'll come up with some questions. If you guys have any questions that you might want to bring to them. I don't know when we want to set the next date. Not sure how much time do you think?
Maybe like 2 weeks, the next off week.
Yeah, of council.
Yeah.
That's fine. Is this time good for everybody?
Sure.
Is this time good for you, Margot?
I'm changing jobs, so I don't know, but I will do my best to, but if I'm not able to attend the meeting, I'm more than willing to do whatever I can do.
Thank you. And what you can do for right now, if you have any questions for code or the code officers, like we can put together those things. We're gonna invite them and
Okay.
code attorneys, I guess, to the next meeting that we have. We'll go from there.
Okay, I can do that and send you an email.
All of them pushing to adjourning.
Yes.
Adjourning. Great.
Adjourn.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome.